Well, thank you very much, and it's certainly my honor to be here today. I wish I could have been here this morning, but these sort of one days in New York, they a little bit oversubscribed today, but appreciate it very much. And today I would like to follow on the conversation I understand you had this morning about the sort of fundamentals of the public-private partnership model and in this emerging world of health system strengthening, to talk about more the innovation agenda within that work. And I would start with a broad statement, which, knowing many of you in the room, this is totally preaching to the choir, but that I find myself often frustrated as PATH is one of the leading organizations doing global health and innovation in global health, that people assume immediately that means we only do technologies and technology innovation. And somehow we've lost in the translation over the last 10 years of people talking about the importance of innovation and it being on everybody's tagline and everybody's marketing campaign, that innovation is more than just technology. And so I'd like to talk today a bit about some of the innovation that's affordable and manageable and the opportunity for more of it in the health system strengthening space that might complement tools and products, but is actually requires the same sort of disruptive approach. So I think that the focus for our work and our mission as an organization, if you don't know us, is really to address inequities in health in the world. So we focus a lot of our attention, in fact, almost exclusively, on the lowest resource settings in the world. And so our job is to think about how to eliminate or shorten an amount of inequity there is in access to good health tools and good health products and services. So and it's a pretty exciting time to be in this space because, as you all know, there's been a lot of attention paid to this question in the last 15 years, and certainly a lot more being paid to what we're going to do in the next 15 years. But I always like to start to remind what we're trying to do here. And our job, as we see it, is pretty simple in terms of how do we reduce morbidity and mortality of women and children in the world, and with a very focused on those that are the least served and the most vulnerable. And as you can see, we've made a lot of good progress. Again, this is data that all of you have and have been part of. But our issue is that how to bend that curve, how to go from the trajectory that's been driven by a lot of growth, a lot of economic progress, a lot of innovation, a lot of good, better services, and actually bend the curve on maternal and child mortality and morbidity in the next 15 years. And so we think a lot, almost exclusively, about what are the kind of game changers that you can actually make to bend that curve. And we do that across multiple approaches. And certainly we think that the next 15 years is going to be a very transformative time. And I sometimes, I've just been in D.C. for 2 days in many different meetings and here, and it's not only the idea that we are going to see the United Nations commit to a new set of, many goals and indicators in September with the Sustainable Development Goals, but we also have other pieces of work that's informing our bet, which include, among others, in a very important Lancet report that talks about the grand convergence in the next 20 years, and then certainly sort of a parallel set of commitments that the Gates Foundation is making toward their bet on the future. But this is just one of many, many things that are telling us that, look, the next 15 years are going to be pretty transformative in bending that curve. And there is a real possibility, if we do it well and we do it smartly and we do it collectively, that we'll actually achieve some of those gold curve bending opportunities. So one of the things that we've done, and I won't speak to it much, but we focus on less the what those indicators are. I figure the global community is spending enough time on that. And we've really pivoted to how we're going to do it. And we know in health there are certain sort of fundamental things that need to get done. And so how do we go about doing that? And what's the innovation agenda within that So we've, with the support of a number of governments and other sponsors, have started this innovation countdown, which has actually been interesting to take a crowdsourced approach to what are the transformative innovations already out there that if we are intentional and plan and scale them with intention, we think that they can actually be that transformative tool. And we know a lot about the work of innovation. I teach it at Stanford, and we talk about it a lot in other contexts, and we know that if you plan innovation, you actually can achieve more than if you just think it's all about really cool accidental discoveries in garages. So, and so we're trying to take that discipline to this. And our approach, and I'll talk just briefly about PATH, and then we'll move to the health system strengthening model, is just to understand that we do this across 5 platforms, which includes vaccines, drugs, diagnostics, devices and tools, and then a lot of work on system and service innovation. Very broad around the world, lots of technologies in our pipeline. And we are actually less a pure R&D play. A research play. We don't have a wet lab. We work more, we like to talk about the middle of that value chain, where we're actually translating a lot of good research that's coming out of academic and industrial labs, and or tools and products that are serving the rich markets, and we can figure out how to adapt them for other markets, and we try to work on the development, validation, approval, and uptake. What we also don't typically do much of is actually full-on implementation. We actually believe that most of the time it's best for us to hand that off to other better equipped players, including governments, including the private sector, which is where we often work, and also including other NGOs. And you know, that's the quick story, and in the Q&A I'm happy to answer other questions about PATH. So we have one of our 5 core platforms, and sometimes I would argue the most important platform is our work on what we call system and service innovation, which I think is the core question in front of you all today. And we think about that across a number of areas, whether it's what we can do on behavioral change and communications and demand creation and all that sort of, how do you actually motivate and enable. We certainly do some on capacity building. We're not focused a lot on the workforce itself, but we often think about what we can do to actually enable the workforce and a different workforce. So a lot of our tools and ideas are about task shifting. So if we can actually shift the complexity and simplify the complexity of a tool, we actually believe that will be it could actually have a huge impact on the health system. And a lot of work on data management, and data and innovation. In fact, this is, I would argue, is truly the biggest opportunity in the health system strengthening area in the next decade. And I'll talk to you about a few examples, but one thing I thought would be useful to talk about a little bit is, rather than just, here's a couple cool examples and how we've scaled them up, but which I love to do. But I also want to talk a little bit about, we've taken a much more, I think, dynamic view than many in the sector on how to manage these partnerships, because I should have said without, I was implicit, but all of the work we do in this area, we don't do alone. We have almost in every instance, in every single one of our projects and products around the world, certainly some sort of academic partner, usually often a government partner, and on most cases an industry partner or 2 or 3 or 5 or 10. And that's essential to our model. So we work a lot across it and have for over up to 40 years on that. But one of the things I've been commenting on and talking about more lately is how we have to actually reshape the way we handle these complex partnerships, because I think there's been this sort of push toward, there is, philanthropy is not as important as it's to do a big shared values commitment, and somehow we've created hierarchies around what are the better kinds of partnerships, and there's a bit of that confusion in the conversation. And my own view is this is a complex portfolio that you've just got to manage, and it's a portfolio that includes great philanthropic commitments, like we've seen in our instance with Medtronic to support some interesting opportunities. We've seen great technical transactional partnerships, from very large ones. We probably work with GSK almost as much or more than anyone. We're very close to because of the work we're doing in malaria and a number of other areas. But we also work with almost every major life sciences organization and many new biotechs as well. But again, sometimes those are in the form of just a license or a patent. Sometimes those are much more strategic in terms of collaboration around the innovation. Sometimes it's a distribution play, because we often think that the best way to get this to advance is actually to de-risk the innovation and then enable the market forces to go and take that forward to the people that need it. But we've had to create, with philanthropic support, that de-risking mechanism. And often we're actually moving, and as you can see in other sectors, and I won't go through, this is actually just a sample, and we've actually, if you actually looked at the full array of path, you wouldn't be able to read it because there's too many dots. But we then have some pretty big signature projects that I'll talk about. One, for example, with BHP Billiton, which is, as you know, one of the largest extraction businesses in the world. And so we really see the working across sectors, working across types of relationships in a much more dynamic fashion and not in a hierarchical fashion is really critical to this conversation, and we need to push that agenda more. A couple examples to just explain sort of what we do and how we do it, but it might inform the conversation about best practices, or it might just be another interesting example. So in the conversation about so for one, is some of these don't require innovation as a full-on, let's start creating new tools, new systems. Sometimes it's a matter of innovating the operating model or innovating the business pipeline. And so here is a good example of a very interesting project in Cambodia, which went right to the core of how do you actually strengthen the health system using more public-private sector relationships where there were existing products. This is not about creating new tools or products. But the problem is they were too fragmented, some of them weren't at scale, and the connection to channels was too weak in that system. And similarly, there was a number of different partnership opportunities, distribution entrepreneurs, certainly the manufacturing capabilities, some in Cambodia itself for these basic household commodities. And so what we did and worked to reshape the sort of market model for this. And this was truly a market-shaping, health system strengthening initiative. Say, look, if you can connect better, it was actually almost re-scrambling the rubric cube in a way to say, if we can connect better the commodities themselves with a more sustainable channel for development, and then provide sort of product design, aggregation, which is really critical so you can get things to scale, more technical assistance and more knowledge management. And then we worked often with MFIs, with microfinance organizations, who became an interesting channel for reaching community and community education. Then we can actually reach households. And I won't go through all the detail for time, but it actually had then resulting in, we ended up seeing about 3-time improvement, and I think it was a 3-year project. And you see the uptake is considerable. And this was, again, not about let's go in and innovate and build a new water filter. This was about, let's look at the existing water filter manufacturing capability, pipeline, supply chain, what are the customer bases, and actually literally applying some fairly not highly sophisticated, but some much needed sort of business discipline to look at the entire ecosystem and then support. It was all Cambodian-led, a team there to continue that, and this project continues. Another example, which is actually one of my favorite right now, is a good example of private sector work in this is where the confluence of urbanization and health and economic empowerment all come together and align. So as one knows, in the slums of Mumbai, there's enormous TB prevalence, and what's interesting is so many people think in the poorest communities in urban areas of India and Africa that the public, it's mainly a public health system, but in fact It turns out the data was about, I think 40% of the residents actually who were getting their TB drugs were getting them through private sector providers. So it turns out in this slum there's 1,100 different types of pharmacies or frontline this or that, which were all, small private sector models. And the problem was there was this gross disincentive, because the private sector guys would actually, if they reported up to the ministry or the subnational ministry, the incidents, then they got disincentivized to keep providing treatment because they would often pull the patient into the public system. So we sat down and worked very closely. This is actually a Gates Foundation funded project, and with the Maharashtra and Mumbai leadership, and reshaped, what the incentive system would be. So to create more incentive to both to register and get people on ongoing treatment, and the diagnostic registration and treatment plan. But was interesting because it required both a reshaping of who got paid for what, rather than taking patients away. The idea was to actually take what part of that public dollar would have taken to pay for that patient and give it as a voucher, a payment voucher, to the private sector provider. And we worked with a couple of organizations to create a digital platform for that voucher payment. And so far, it's still a work in progress, but the early data after about 9 months shows that we've had about 6,000 new patients register for this, using this kind of capability. So this is, to me, and there's lots more we could talk about it, I think it's kind of an early indicator of some real opportunity for urban health system transformation. How do we go in and think about incentives and digital tools to get us there? The final one I'll mention really quickly, because I signaled it earlier, is our project that is another actually very good example, I think, of public-private partnerships around health system strengthening in complex situations. And this is in 6 districts in South Africa and Mozambique, where we're partnering with BHP Billiton, who have obviously a large presence and a significant community interest in certain communities, but we've come together around to design a multi-year set of activities to actually work with some of their expertise and their data tools, et cetera, to work on redesigning the clinic level health model. And this is really targeted toward the first 1,000 days, and this is a classic example of integrated delivery, first 1,000 days, the most vulnerable time for women and children. And what do we need to do to collect and improve the quality of data? What can we do to actually provide more services, including some of those things that are often not considered, like faster ambulatory care, incentives for digital tools, which people have in many instances to get people into the clinic sooner for prenatal care and things like that. So it's also, we're seeing some early data coming out after a couple of years of the project that are showing significant reductions in certain categories. And we had a bunch of data slides and I took them out, but I realized looking at this audience, I probably should have brought them. So anyway, it's a great journey I think we're on. I'm happy to spend some time answering questions or comments, either from the PATH perspective, which now I think we are doing a lot of very interesting work, but I, as many of you know, have been in this space for a number of years with other hats and other organizations, including Simon and I working together the Global Fund a few years ago, and helping think about how do we align better the multi-sector interests, because it's just my fundamental kind of belief, and what my passion are two things. One is that innovation is going to change the world. It continues to, but we have to think of innovation broadly, not just technologically, and it is the opportunity ahead of us. But it has to, all these big 21st century challenges just have to be done through stronger multi-sectoral approaches. We just can't go it alone. And business, government, academic, nonprofit are all essential elements, and we're determined to make that happen. And I think it would be great if this group could take on a bigger and broader and more aggressive brokering role and to advance that agenda. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Steve. Let me open it up for the questions. Yes, Kathy, thanks.
Hi, I'm Kathy Taylor from the University of Notre Dame. I liked your example of the TB in Mumbai and the relationship between public-private. The first thing that came to my mind is, in those private clinics, we're pretty sure that the drugs might not be of very high quality. So, and we've had some discussions about quality in other contexts. So can you discuss then in these partnerships how you think about that and how you work with your partners and improving quality? Yeah,
for sure. So we have sort of taken as a sort of strategic approach the effort we are trying to bring together across all of our organization is first and foremost to increase the quality of and impact of our work, whatever it is, and then also try to increase the efficiency and the value proposition, because we got to figure out how to make these things increasingly more affordable. So it varies, but the primary thing I think are twofold. One is having strong technical capabilities embedded in almost any one of these programs, and or embedded within the ministries or whoever we're working with, and then ensuring that they have both the ability, both in terms of the coverage of time and things like that, but also the kind of the authority and that varies around the world, but to oversee some of the quality issues. So in this instance, we actually have a number of TB experts that actually, over the course of any given, are constantly visiting these providers, checking their stock, and in fact, there's actually been a lot of question about whether we need to work on more the supply chain issues around that, both in terms of quality and access. But that's a good example of kind of embedding. In some other instances, it's a much more challenging, where you for instance, this is not an example so much on the health system strengthening side, but one of the sort of big efforts we made in the last decade. Some would say, I think Margaret Chan thought it was one of the big victories in global health in the last decade, is getting the Japanese encephalitis vaccine pre-qualified by WHO, and PATH, with support from the Gates Foundation and others, took that on about a decade ago, and said, look, we don't have an adequate supply of JE vaccine. It's too expensive. It's priced out of the public market. But there is a safe and affordable and a much, much cheaper vaccine in China. The problem is it's in China. And so work went through a very challenging 10-year process of upgrading closely with Chinese government, with the manufacturer, with WHO, with our technical support, and to work on how to continue to build that quality assurance, build the right tools, test, retest, and achieve that pre-qualification. Now that's an ongoing process, obviously, but I think a lot of it just is down, dirty, tactical every day. You got to be there, you got to show up, and you got to have some authority to challenge, which we had in that instance.
Thanks, Steve. Yes, Ambassador Lang.
Thank you, Steve. Very interesting. I've been thinking to myself of what we're supposed to be discussing in these 2 days, the role of public-private partnerships in health system strengthening. And I guess my take on what the examples that you gave was to strengthen components of the health system. Because there's no way that PATH can just take on strengthening the entire health system of Nigeria or something like that, and we wouldn't expect you to. And to really...
Thank you. I don't want that assignment.
And to really make a difference, it does get down to that nitty-gritty that you're talking about there. Do you have any thoughts, though, about the broad health systems as to how how the world, especially with the expected target of universal health coverage and the Sustainable Development Goals, how does one look at it broadly as opposed to having hundreds and thousands of organizations taking their little parts of and components of that health system, and maybe in the end it's strengthened in its entirety, or maybe not?
Yeah, and it's a great question, John, and I would probably start with the caveat that I'm a Montana farm boy who's sort of a practical guy at the end of the day. So, if you can take a bit and do that and then do it a field at a time, you usually get there at the time. And so I'm not sure that we should dismiss the ability to incrementalize in this space, and I think it's important that we do keep, there's going to be a lot of fragmented work, which is unfortunate, but I think it is sort of inevitable. I do think there are two or three things. I would bucket in a couple different big buckets. I mean, rich world, sort of emerging, postgraduate Garvey, world, and then sort of the really high conflict and poor worlds are going to be very different how you look at that. Certainly, I think we're in a place where having any kind of systemic effort at any substantial level in places like South Sudan or Syria are probably not it's not. We're going to have to go in and do intervention by intervention. The opportunity is in that middle bucket, which I actually do think we're seeing much better evidence of national plans, of national capability in institutions. And so from my view, and it's certainly embedded in what we're trying to do, is to say our job is not to do that for anybody. It's just to provide assistance at their really request. Sometimes we can push an agenda, but really at their request. And they have to come up with a more comprehensive approach themselves with better data and better ideas and tools. And I think we're seeing some of that in certain countries more than others. But for instance, we're working closely in Zambia right now with a number of projects, including a lot in a really innovative and, well, Gina knows more about it than I do, but the malaria control efforts that are getting deeply into how they actually organize within the ministry and what kind of identification tools they use for surveillance and what kind of tracking mechanisms. So it's sort of like, it's almost like that's the wedge which we can now go into and work with them. There is a project that I think is pretty transformative, John, though, that I'm a big believer in, as you can tell, in the opportunities with the digital tools. I have, though, been in audiences. I was joking with someone earlier this morning that I was in an audience in Davos with a bunch of very enthusiastic, West Coast entrepreneurs and very, desperate ministries of health looking for tools. And I had to finally remind them that actually biology still mattered in health, that somehow people have gotten so caught up in all these apps and digital this and digital that they forgot that, there are things like viruses and, parasites. So we've got to keep that in check. But one of the projects we're doing is a big project in immunization data, and it's less about putting new tools in countries, but working with a number of countries in Africa, particularly Tanzania, Zambia, and Ghana right now, but to help them think about their whole health information architecture and redesign that architecture, particularly in places where often with immunization data being often the first point of contact a child will have with a public system. So where they're not registering births in certain areas, but there's a fairly high rate of immunization in the first month, that you can use that as your first point for a data model. And that is actually quite almost to the opposite of 1,000 apps coming into the country. We're actually saying don't push the 1,000 apps. That's not the right approach. Figure out your overall architecture and structure of how this is going to work and what kind of things you need, and then build on top of that foundation. And that might be helpful. I don't think it's the full answer.
Will you take two more?
Okay, sure.
Thanks very much. My name is Betty Farrell, and I'm a consultant in women's health. And I'm keenly interested in the redesign of the clinical health service model in the first 1,000 days. And could you say a little bit more about what you're finding that would have a relationship to guiding decision-making about public-private partnerships and the role of community in that?
Well, I think the first thing I would say, which will not surprise anybody in this room, and it does not, I don't mean it to be the wet blanket, but I think the first thing is hard. I mean, and I'm not going to be that glib about it, but I think we are seeing that even getting into a partnership like this with the government and with one of the big extraction industry players and with a nonprofit, just managing the politics and perception issues around that alone have been interesting and challenging. And then figuring out what we can each bring to the table and where the complementary assets and resources are, how to make sure this is all done within the framework of the government and the communities themselves, so that it's certainly something that's not imposed from the outside. We're here to be sort of technical supports. So that would be one. The second, I think, there are quite a few more detailed technical things that I'm happy to get someone to send them to you around, where we've seen prenatal care coverage go up because we've communicated better, we've got more demand creation in the communities. We've recognized at some point again that ambulatory care was one of the big issues, that everybody was missing that link and how people are actually being able to get from primary to secondary care centers and things like that. But the second big one I would say is, I think, appalled at data quality. And this isn't me. This is like people that have been on the ground working in this industry forever. But just like, actually, if you dig in and work with better tools, it's just we're building too many of these things on the wrong data assumptions, that we approximate data too much, and so that's actually been quite a big aha in this. That the data. So there was a pivot at some point that a lot needed to do with just data and data quality. But I have to tell you that data, this is a great story of how innovation happens. I remember I was in a very, very depressing and very challenging township in one of their health centers, and this very wonderful, larger-than-life, crusty old midwife or nurse who was running it, she's showing me the logbook that the government issues, and it's here's for every patient, and it had like 7 columns, and then I noticed that she had, with her own pen, had started creating about 8 or 9 more columns, and I said, well, what are those? And so, long story short is, actually she knew what she needed to know, and she was trying to find it out in addition to what the government told her she needed to know. So instead of her that's a good example of then taking her learnings, and then we went and did this around, and then we actually aggregated that, and now actually the logbook's going to look different. It's going to eventually be online or be digital, but that's less important. It's just more, and so trying to understand not only data quality, but what data matters has been another big finding, but there's many others.
Thank you, Steve. The discussion of health systems, when you talk to people that deal with the verticals, whether it's an infectious disease or a condition like pregnancy or maternal mortality, quite often gets a little bit, is it vertical or is it horizontal? Can you talk about, I could, but really it's better if you do, talk about any one of those examples where a vertical project fed into the horizontals? I was thinking about the JE vaccine, and if you had tried to go into China to improve their production procedures, would you have been received as well as working on one of their vaccines to get it to be accepted internationally, and then what happened afterwards?
Yeah.
Which would work better?
Yeah, I would probably pause and say, I'd have to think about it, and also I think the examples are quite different. But I would say we're seeing a number of verticals that, let's take 2 examples. One in the JE, where I do think that that's begun to happen. So with going in and maybe, and this is maybe more that incremental piece, but saying we're going to not be, there's one, relatively small, although the impact is huge, but, small thing we're going to do, a JE vaccine. I was actually told, and speaking of my Montana background, I was telling my Montana mother I remember at Christmas, somebody said, well, what was one of the biggest things that happened this year? And I said, well, the WHO PQ of JE. And she said, oh my God, you've been in that health space too long. So that would be a warning for all of you. I do think that going in narrowly and now having a seat at the table. So we actually now have a seat at that table. In fact, I was in D.C. yesterday as part of the state, the U.S.-China dialogue on strategic and economic cooperation on China-U.S. relations, and they've created a pillar in health, and Riming Hui and I were there, and that was why we were there, is because we now are talking about, particularly in the NCD category, much more transformative work that could be done with good technical assistance has been proven, not threatening, not political, etc. So I think the other one I would say would be an interesting issue, which is, again, you all are familiar with, but is in as the U.S. has, and I have to say this carefully, has disproportionately invested in HIV, right? If you look at in the global health budget, about 40% of the U.S. global health budget is in HIV, which is a phenomenal story, and PEPFAR and what PEPFAR has done and transformed the world. But of course, the challenge is those numbers don't stack up against the need as much, and how do we move beyond that in terms of the U.S.'s engagement on as a government. And so we have a very large project which is PEPFAR funded in Western Kenya, and we have done, and it's targeted to HIV, and that was very much of a vertical play. But we've actually taken it, since we've now embedded for a number of years, strong relationships with the community level, and working on, we've actually taken and we found new dollars from new sources, not PEPFAR funded, to go and introduce additional system service models. So we've actually taken that very narrow, a lot of money, but fairly narrowly defined PEPFAR platform, and then we've added in a number of things in maternal child health, TB control. We're looking at new areas for malaria, but we're also, there's a new NCD project. We just got the Ministry of Health to introduce, this is a tool, but a really innovative idea coming out of watching midwives to use, a balloon tamponade for postpartum hemorrhage, which was sustainable and affordable. I mean, we actually are introducing that in these clinics as well. So it has become sort of a platform for strengthening using better tools or better systems. Thank you very much.
Steve, thanks very much indeed. I just want to, thank you.